Good evening, and welcome to tonight's Dean Salon, House Hunters, Babylon, 1300 BCE. And now, I would like to introduce our host, Ann Walters Robinson, Dean of the Humanities Division.
Good evening. I'm Ann Walters Robertson, Dean of the Division of the Humanities at the University of Chicago. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to our first Dean Salon of 2021. I'm thrilled all of you have joined us to hear our speaker, Susanne Paulus, for an episode of House Hunters that will take us further back in time than any other, indeed, approximately 2,000 years before the invention of television. Susanne will tell us about buying property in ancient Babylon and her work to reconstruct the economic and social life of this civilization. Now, the study of how people in other places and times lived and thought about their lives and what we can learn about ourselves by understanding them has been an integral part of the University of Chicago since we were founded more than 130 years ago. Today, across the Division of the Humanities, our faculty study languages, cultures, histories, and religions of peoples from the beginning of civilization to the present. Our work spans 6 continents and thousands of years. Many of you will know that the Oriental Institute and its extraordinary collection are critical to the University of Chicago's leadership in studying ancient civilizations. The Humanities Division and the OI work closely together to advance knowledge of ancient Near Eastern civilizations. For those of you who don't know the OI, it is a jewel of a museum located on our campus at 58th Street and University Avenue. During the pandemic, of course, you can interact with the OI and its collections virtually. But once it is safe to do so, I do encourage you to visit the museum for the first time or to return for a second or third look and experience the OI's fantastic holdings firsthand. It's an exceptionally well-curated collection, and I know you will enjoy it. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Susanne Paulus, Associate Professor of Assyriology in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations, as well as Tablet Collections Curator at the OI. Susanne exemplifies our distinguished history of teaching and scholarship in the Near East. Its outstanding scholarship powerfully unites theoretical innovation with careful empirical discovery. Susanne, who joined UChicago in 2015, specializes in the social, legal, and economic history of the ancient Near East, especially of the Middle Babylonian period, Kassite period, that is 1500 to 1000 BC. Her work combines traditional methods of archival reconstruction with newer instruments like historic social network analysis to reconstruct family structures, administrative organization, and the socio-political and economic landscape of Babylon. And now I'm excited to turn the virtual podium over to Susanne for this evening's conversation.
Thank you, Anne, for this very kind introduction, and thank you for giving me the possibility to speak here to all of you, and thanks to all of you for coming out and watching my talk. In early 2019, my husband and I bought our first house in the midst of winter, weather very similar to the current conditions, polar vortex included. We were house hunting and worried about things like location, size, and exposure, neighbors, and then obviously financing our dream home. All this, including reading the deed and related documents at the closing, reminded me a lot what I do normally professionally. However, what I do professionally is a little bit different also, dealing with real estate transfers, but with the exception that those documents usually are more than 3,000 years old, excavated in ancient Iraq, and written in cuneiform script, like this fragmentary house sail recently excavated by the Oriental Institute in Nippur. In 2019, another dream of mine became true. After waiting a period of 13 years, I finally got the permission to study a series of cuneiform tablets from ancient Babylon, a capital of Babylonia, 50 miles south of Baghdad, which are nowadays in the Vorderasiatische Museum in Berlin. So why were those tablets so special to me? As the tablet collection curator here at the OI, I deal daily with amazing tablets the OI excavated. But as a scholar, personally, I focus not on the texts of kings or literary masterworks, but on records of private people living in ancient Iraq, especially during the so-called Kassite or Middle Babylonian period of the late Bronze Age, or the period between 1500 and 1150 BCE. And as a legal and economic historian, like Anne mentioned, I'm interested in questions of money and investment, how to increase and protect one's assets in the antiquity. And one of the best sources for these questions are ancient real estate sale documents. However, for a very long period, for a very long time, only a single house sale contract was known for my period of interest, like the Kassite period. This all changed in 2005 when Olaf Pedersen published a comprehensive catalog of the clay tablets. In this study, he presented for the first time the tablets excavated by the German Babylon expedition of the Royal Museums in Berlin and the Deutsche Orientgesellschaft almost 100 years ago. So it took 100 years to get a catalog of the tablets. The catalog mentioned several Kassite house sale documents. And for a then young student who had just finished her MA, this was a treasure. And I excitedly applied for access to those tablets. However, the permission was delayed for 13 years, the main reason being that other scholars, including Leonard Sassmannshausen, a specialist of Kassite text, had to work on those first. At the time, Leonard shared a few notes on several texts with me, which proved how relevant they were for my work. I must say, however, that the following remarks are based on my own studies, which I started in 2019. You can imagine how happy I was to see those tablets for the first time after waiting for 13 years. I was even more appreciative because I knew that they had an adventurous journey they took from Babylon in Iraq to Berlin in Germany. They were excavated by Robert Koldewey and his team in Babylon. You can see the excavator here in Babylon in what is an early selfie, performing the important task of feeding the excavation's cats. As it was customary in the early 20th century, the finds were divided between the excavating institutions and the host country. At this time, this was still the Ottoman Empire. The division was supposed to happen in Constantinople, meaning modern-day Istanbul. However, due to political events, meaning the outbreak of the First World War, most of the German team had to leave the excavations in 1915, when the Allied British troops arrived. The crates with the object, including my tablets, were left in heat and then brought via ship on the Euphrates to Hadissa. And the transport was really difficult and something really unfortunate happened. So either some boxes slipped from the boat or they were soaked with water. But when they arrived at the next station, all the objects, the fragile objects, were wet. Nevertheless, those objects were lucky since several crates had been forgotten on the docks or left behind in Babylon, and those ended up later in the Iraq Museum. It would not have been before 1917 that the opportunity rose to replace the water-damaged crates and ship them on the Euphrates again, reaching ancient Carchemish, which is on the border to modern-day Turkey, after several stops. There, my crates were loaded on the famous Berlin-Baghdad train and then brought to Constantinople. Koldewey, the excavator, who had stayed on site amidst the war until 1917, arranged the division with Halil Bey of the Imperial Ottoman Museum, and the tablets finally made their way to Berlin, where they likely arrived in early 1918, while World War I was still raging on. Back to me and the tablets. It's 100 years later, and I was sitting alone in the reading room of the Vorderasiatische Museum, reading those tablets I had waited so long for. When studying 1,000-year-old texts written on fragile clay, it is common that the tablets are damaged and sections are lost. You see this very well in the middle document, that it's fairly damaged and a lot of them are really badly broken. So the fact that my texts were in rough shape, missing often vital portions, was not like a particular surprise to me. This type of damage most often occurred either back in antiquity or during excavations. And there is actually little you can do other than try to work around it and reconstruct the best you can. Out of curiosity, I also requested access to the old excavation photos taken back in Babylon 100 years ago, right after the discovery of the tablets. I did not expect much, as I had read that the photographer had to usually put multiple tablets in one shot due to the attached cost per picture back then. However, I was in for a real treat. What I received were black and white images of the highest quality. They proved that significant damage on the tablets actually had not occurred in antiquity, but likely during transport. So who would have thought like dunking tablets in Euphrates water and leaving them wet for a prolonged time is not the best way to treat the tablets. But the photos also show some of the tablets which are nowadays lost or have not been located yet. And using modern technology allows me to combine the excavation photos with my own. And then I use both to reconstruct the ancient text in cuneiform. That takes a while, but by doing so, we actually learn a lot about the texts and also about real estate in Babylon. And that's, after all, what you're here for. So let's travel to Babylon in 1300 BCE. So this is 550 years before the famous King Nebuchadnezzar, so quite early. The Babylonian owner of the tablets decided to put them together in a clay pot. This may seem a strange place to keep documents, but this is not uncommon during that time. So instead of a folder, this Babylonian actually wrapped his tablets in straw. Instead of a drawer or shelf, he stored them in a clay vessel. And putting connected documents together helped him so he could retrieve them fairly easily when needed. The excavators discovered this pot in a partially excavated house, which they labeled House at the Crossroads. The house itself belonged to the so-called Merkes, not Merkel quarter, a residential neighborhood in Babylon. And we will take a closer look at this neighborhood later. Let's first look into our clay pot and see what we can find out. The pot contained a total of 7 tablets, all of them concerning real estate. However, that doesn't mean that the owner had 7 houses. Like in modern time, 1 or in this case 2 houses can mean a lot of paperwork, or as Assyriologists would call it, clay work. And we actually love to sort through those ancient documents, reconstructing the connections between the texts. The oldest are 2 documents that deal with a house with a certain Beli Idinam bought from Mudamik Adad and his son. 71 years later, a descendant of this Beli Idinam sold the same house to Eshu Rabi, son of Kubuya, a brewer. And when selling the house, he transferred the old document with the house and gave them to the new owner. That's why we do have them. He also included information about a lawsuit, likely about this very house, and he had just won the lawsuit. In the absences of title companies or title insurance, people had to ensure themselves that the purchase was legit, with the buyer, Eshu Rabi, keeping those documents. While 5 documents concern the first house, the 2 other concern the second house and a garden, which Eshu Rabi had actually bought 10 years earlier. And so all of those documents are connected what we call by the archive holder or the house owner, Eshu Rabi, son of Kubuya, a brewer by profession. So before we explore the 2 houses further, I think you want to have a closer look at what one of those real estate sale documents look like. And I want to introduce you to the most important features. So every contract starts with a description of the property. Then other elements of the purchase are given. The parties are identified and the price is stated. During the Middle Babylonian period, detailed information on how the buyer paid the price is stated. This is being followed by contingency clauses and penalties. We'll have a closer look at them should a party break the contract. A purchase of real estate was a public affair, so we have a lot of witnesses included in the document, and the contract usually ends with a date. And if you remember your own closing, one of the crucial moments is when you actually sign the final contracts. Mesopotamians did not sign, but they did what you see to the left on the document. They rolled their personal seal, a stone cylinder with images and text over the wet clay. And by rolling the seal, the seller indicated that he had indeed transferred the property rights to the new owner. Let's see what Eshu Rabi bought. And we want to first look at the second house, which I called House B, his earlier acquisition. So the description of the real estate is fairly complete. It's a rather small plot of land, so roughly a little bit more than 2,000 square feet. This is slightly larger than the lot of our small townhouse in Hyde Park. Mesopotamians described lots usually by naming the neighboring properties in all 4 directions. So this bordered on another house in the north and possible on a garden to the south. To the east, the plot borders on the King's Road, and to the west on a canal. Those descriptions help to identify the property relatively easy. The description mentions also that there was a garden located on the plot. This is probable as the median size for houses from the slightly earlier period, we don't have really good comparative material for the Kassite period, was around 1,000 square foot. So this would leave enough room for a garden on the plot. So while we scholars often imagine ancient cities as clay jungles, we should at least add some greenery as on this painting in the OI. However, those gardens are not the elusive hanging gardens of Babylon, but we are talking about small private gardens with a few date palms providing shade and some sugary dates. And the inhabitants probably also grew their own vegetables under the trees. And an important requirement for gardening in ancient Babylon, as it's in modern day Chicago, is obviously access to water. And this was like provided here because it's bordering a canal. And to be honest, nothing is special about this house, including its absolutely reasonable price of 11 shekels of gold, which is in line of the only other house we did know at the time from the Kassite period. The second house Eshurabi purchased 10 years later is a totally different story. Its price was almost 10 times more, so a hefty 109 shekels of gold. And unfortunately, we do not have information on its size. However, the text mentions an impressive 19 rooms. So it must have been a quite sizable house. And sadly, the excavators weren't able to excavate more than just a small portion of this house where the tablets were found. So you can see this, not everything what's reconstructed here was actually excavated. So only like those small squares where we do have more details were excavated. So the whole like ground plan, the floor plan is reconstructed. So we do not know if this was actually a house with 19 rooms or what a house with 19 rooms looked like during the Kassite period. Again, missing really good comparison. So what I did, I just bring up here a much later first millennium house from the same city quarter in Babylon, which has 18 rooms and an impressive 8,000 square foot. So, and we face like another problem which is connected with this partially excavation. That is that the floor plan and the exacter borders of the house where the tablets were found remain unknown. Consequently, we do not know whether this house is actually the large house described on the contracts. The archaeologists thought that the building they excavated did border on two streets, one to the north and one to the west. But my description on the tablet mentions that there is only one street and that's to the south. So I hope this mystery can be solved in the near future, especially because people like Katja Stanitsky are working again on the archaeology of Babylon and are reconsidering this. Meanwhile, I'm optimistic that the purchased house was likely located in the Merkez quarter or in a similar quarter in central Babylon. And the reason for my assumption is this really high price. We are still exploring what influenced prices in Kassite Babylonia. For houses, the criteria were likely size, condition and extras, and location. So not very different from modern houses. The condition of the large house is rather typical for Babylonian standards and a little bit disappointing for modern buyer standards. So it's only mentioning that some rooms were in good condition while others were ready to be torn down and built anew. So a fixer-upper. Babylonian houses were built from unbaked brick, and walls had to be frequently repaired and renewed. And it's very common that the new owner changed things based on his needs. So the condition does not justify a high price. So what's about the location? Merkez was located in the center of ancient Babylon and really next to the temple of Marduk. So you see that here. And Marduk became the most prominent deity during the Kassite Middle Babylonian period. And Heather Baker, the leading specialist on Babylonian cityscapes, noted that the urban elite reinforced their status by physical proximity to the centers of power. So being close to the gods and the king was most desirable than living out in the suburbs. And the archaeologists noted that Merkez became actually more luxurious during the Kassite period, possibly connected to its proximity to the Marduk temple. So what was house hunting like in ancient Babylon? And I must a little bit disappoint you here. Many Babylonians may not have looked for a new house in their whole life. Men inherited the house from their fathers, while women moved into the homes of their husbands. But when a father had several sons, the house was divided among the children. And in this case, one son could buy out the others, who had then looked for new dwellings of their own. And we know this for Ashurabi, who was actually a younger son. So he seemed to have not substantially inherited from his father. Beli Idinam, on the other side, the first owner, he bought the house likely because it was adjacent to that of his brother in the north. And his family kept the house for 71 years. And then when they finally sold it to Ashurabi, the contract showed that none of the neighboring houses had changed ownership in those 71 years. So they were still owned by the same families. And we could actually believe that Ashurabi was quite lucky to buy such a big house in a prime location. This house was, as I already mentioned, extremely pricey. And let me illustrate this a bit. 109 shekel of gold. This means roughly 32 ounces of gold, or in gold bar the size of a small iPhone, an iPhone 6 to be precise, if you can remember those. With 109 shekel of gold, a Babylonian at the time would have been able to buy 11 male or 15 female slaves, or 27 oxen or donkeys, or 109 standard garments, or 218 sheep, or getting bigger and bigger, 32,000 liters of grain, or this would correspond to 45 years of grain allocations to a simple male worker as compensation for his work. So how could Ashurabi, a brewer, afford such an expensive purchase? And luckily, my Middle Babylonian texts do contain exact information on how the price was paid. And while the sum is stated in gold, our brewer really only paid 9 shekels in gold directly. And for the remaining sum, he paid 21 shekels in miscellaneous goods, including 7 garments, 22 pounds of raw wool, 22 pounds of tin, 40 liters of oil, and 1 donkey. The largest amount, likely corresponding to 79 shekels of gold, was paid in grain in barley, 24,900 liters to be precise, or enough to fill 2.5 of those silos pictured here. The distribution of goods is fairly common, what we know for the period, where most prices were paid with a mix of commodities. So imagine, however, schlepping all those goods to the closing. And I found this indeed curious, so I spent much time researching how those payments were really facilitated. And in the time where no banks existed, all goods had to be transferred between the parties. Scholars usually believed that the transfer was cash and immediate. In contrast, I could show that large prices like this were usually paid with a mixture of cash and credit. So gold, gold and some of the mixed goods were often given immediately at the down payment, as a down payment. Perishable goods on the other side, like oil and especially barley, were given over time. And instead of literally being drowned with grain at the closing, you can imagine that the seller preferred to get smaller amounts over time, which he then could process or use otherwise. And as a consequence of those arrangements, seller and buyer were often connected over long periods of time, as there were still like outstanding payments. And imagine owning your monthly rate, not to a bank, but paying it directly to the seller. So while we now like understand a bit how Eshurabi paid for his house, we still cannot understand how he could afford it. And to that, we need to look in what kind of a brewer he was. So Eshurabi did likely not run a microbrewery or a tavern in Babylon. The witnesses in the contract indicate that he was a high-ranking brewer working for the temple. And we know more about these brewers and their finances from an archive from Ur from the same time period. So not only did they hold a high social status, but they also received direct grain allocations by the king. The purpose was obviously to brew beer for the temple and its inhabitants, the gods. And as beer is made from barley, they were given huge amounts at the yearly harvest. And while they transformed some of the beer into, let's say, liquid gold, they used some of it for other purposes as well. And again, in the absence of banks, they served as creditors, issuing smaller amounts of barley as credits to neighbors and other acquaintances. Interest rates on barley were commonly 33% per annum, so brewers could make substantial gains by loaning out their barley. And we know that they invested those gains in garments, animals, slaves, and in our case, in real estate. So while receiving the payment was certainly the seller's most important concern, our buyer, Eshurabi, was mostly interested in protecting his newly acquired title. We already saw some common measures to protect a title in ancient Babylonia. The seller transferred the documents pertaining to the history of ownership to the buyer. There were also witnesses present at the closing, and both parties commonly swore an oath by the gods and the king to not transgress or violate the terms of sale. In addition, especially Middle Babylonian documents added hefty financial and bloody penalties to their contracts to discourage any violation of the terms of sale. I must warn you that some of these punishments are quite explicit, and if you're sensitive, you might want to skip the next few minutes. The idea behind the penalties was to discourage the seller, members of his family, or outsiders to change the contract, raise a claim or on the house or real estate, or dispute its ownership. Should the house be claimed illegally, the buyer would receive compensation by gaining ownership of the seller's house. In addition, he could have to pay a hefty fine of 30 shekels of gold and 60 shekels of silver into the collection box of the god Marduk. In another clause, the offender was asked to pay in form of especially a white horse with black markings. While these fines were likely economically devastating, the bloody contract penalties were even worse. Often, several of them are mentioned in a single contract. Punishing the body part that raised the claims or disputed something, that's being the mouse. One example from the archive lists that as a punishment, they will pour 70 ounces of hot asphalt and 70 ounces of hot bitumen into his mouth, or that they will sprinkle 70 ounces of goat hair and 70 ounces of wool into his mouth, and then he will be killed. While this sounds very cruel, I believe the idea was mostly to deter a potential offender. In reality, we do not read about real estate disputes being resolved by eating goat hair, and archaeologists haven't discovered skeletons with bitumen-filled skulls. What we know from this very archive and others is that disputes about real estates were fairly common between family members, neighbors, sellers and buyers, and others. They often dragged along over long periods of time. In the cases here, they dragged even on over the death of one of the party members. Local authorities first served as judges, but ultimately the cases were often transferred to the king, the highest authority in Babylonia. And in the verdict, the king often decided who got the real estate, while the other party was left empty-handed. Punishments are actually really rarely mentioned at all, and if they are monetary. But losing a property was always a worry. And knowing this, you can understand that Eshurabi did his best to protect his new purchases by adding a lot of clauses in his documents. After all, he had invested a lot and was lucky to have a great house in such a good location. But rather than focusing on his worries, imagine him for a moment, satisfied, putting all his deeds carefully in a jar in the corner of his house before heading to the courtyard, sitting on a bench, enjoying the sunset in Babylon in the shadow of the great zikkurat. And with that, thank you for your attention and thanks for joining us. And I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Susanne. This was really so exciting and interesting. Now, we're very eager for your questions, so please do send them to us using the Q&A function. And let me start with a few that have already come in. In fact, a lot of the really interesting questions came in, and then you, in a couple of instances, gave us the answer. But I will just mention that there was great interest in Babylon's system of estate law and what effects inheritance law would have had on real estate holdings. And I think you maybe want to just summarize that once again.
Yeah, so what we know about inheritance, it's mostly between on the male line, really. So houses were divided between the brothers. We do not have that many inheritance divisions from that period. So I'm mostly drawing about knowledge from other periods where like the sons inherited the house and shared it between them. And often, as I mentioned, that also led to changes if the house was becoming too small or if one was buying out the others, or if no sons were there, then obviously changes could be made also.
Great. Another question was, you showed us this wonderful table about what 109 shekels would be worth. And the question was actually about the 11 shekels. So are we supposed to sort of divide by 10, if you will, to understand what 11 shekels would have been worth? And is there a way to think of that in US dollars, for instance?
I mean, it's really hard to transfer ancient prices in dollars. And the way I would do it is or I did it in this one slide, is showing you what you could buy at the time. So for 11 shekels, you could buy 11 great garments, or you could buy 2 slaves. You could buy several sheep. So it's a sizable amount of money, but it's really hard to put like any modern dollar values to those ancient prices. So I rather see them in the ancient system than comparing to the modern one. Obviously, you could calculate the modern gold prices, but this would give you nothing. Yeah.
Yes, well, but it was still very vivid, I think, what you showed us. And here's another question. What is the availability of items that remained in Turkey? And is there more information there?
This is a great question. And actually, 2 colleagues in Germany recently started a project on working on the documents in Turkey. And some of the, so those are, and we are exchanging like what I have and they have. And sometimes like if I'm missing a tablet, it might be that they find it in Istanbul in the museum. And then a lot of the later material after the foundation of Iraq ended up in the Iraq Museum. So those colleagues are also really important partners to us because some of the objects are also there.
Great. Now here's an interesting question. Could properties be leased rather than owned? And do we have records of these leasing agreements? And are there relevant similarities or differences between owning and leasing in ancient Babylon?
Yeah, so leasing is actually always a possibility. So you could rent a house from this period, we have very little rental contracts or agreements, but from all the other periods, we have ample of them. And the difference would obviously that you have to pay like a yearly lease rate to the owner of the house. Also, sometimes it's stated, and that might be a really fun thing, that the door was already installed and had to stay there, and you could not take the door away, or there was no door installed. And the reason is that wood was really precious in ancient Babylonia. So also the sale contracts mention if there are doors installed in the house or not. So imagine bringing your own doors.
That's amazing. Is anything known about the taxation of houses, whether based on size versus value, or and whether only on the land, location, or a combination of both land and building?
That's another really great question. And as someone living in Chicago, I'm actually at that point very jealous of ancient Babylonians because real estate was not taxed. Houses were not taxed. So people, there were taxes on on agricultural production, but sometimes there were some like things paid per in later periods per house to the temple. I'm not a total specialist at those, but in the Kassite periods, we have like no indication that there were taxes on like owning a house.
Great. Uh, Here's another question. I'm wondering about the nature of the transaction, which you described in such great detail in terms of the persons involved. Was it simply a person to person, the seller and the buyer, or was there a middleman, a real estate agent, or was this another way in which we should be envious because there wasn't that 6% real estate fee?
We know, I think we haven't encountered like real estate agents in ancient Babylonia yet. What we know from the other parallel Middle Assyrian period is that there was like local involvement from the city and people announcing the sale and those kind of actions. We haven't seen those in Babylonia yet either. So it seemed to be, at least from the documents, a private affair. But you had like all those witnesses present, which made it very official, and those often were high-ranking officials. And we do not know in this period if they had to pay them. They likely had to pay the scribe who wrote the document.
Uh-huh. Here's another question about this sort of the present day status of these wonderful tablets. Are there any plans to publish an edition of the tablets underlying this work? And if so, what is the role of the Oriental Institute and the university in publishing the tablets?
So currently, the Vorderasiatische Museum has allowed me to work on the publication of those tablets. So yeah, that's what I'm working on. And it's not only like those 7, but there are like many more from several more archives, which are like also fun because they are very different in content and they are like covering other aspects of the economy. So
Great. Are there any records of women owning houses? Half of our audience wants to know this.
yeah, there are. And like those houses here, they are not owned by women, but we do know them from other periods. And we also, like, especially for the Middle Babylonian period, we know, for example, from a few priestesses who were very wealthy and seem to have owned not only possibly some real estate, but also some farming lands. So yeah, it's definitely possible to own that, for women.
Right. And another thought that has come to someone in our audience, sort of based on practices in our modern era, is there any evidence at all of bidding wars among multiple buyers?
I'm laughing because we were like buying our first house. We ended up in a multi-offer situation on the very first offer we were making. So we do not, I can just say we do not know. That, because what we know from the ancient period, we always know through the written documents, and those are not written down. What I see in my archive, but that would be the topic of another talk, I think none of those purchases which they made here, like the 2 houses, none of that went really smooth. So the first one, the larger one, had like a really long ongoing lawsuit about it before it could be, which needed to be resolved before it could be sold. And the second one, he seemed to have disputed with his elder brother about it, and he had to buy out his elder brother, or older brother. So nothing went smooth here.
Interesting. Now, here's a question from a retired real estate attorney who is very curious whether experts assisted with preparing these contracts. So again, a lot of us are thinking about, are there middle people in these deals?
So on the like those contracts is something they learned to write in scribal school. So they were trained in their school as part of their education to draw those like contracts. And the language of those contracts is actually millennia old. And we see that because sometimes they do no longer understand certain clauses or something what they put in there. We know the profession of some of the scribes, and actually when they did not write those contracts, they were also working for the temple, so they were not like professional real estate people. So actually one of my scribes is normally doing extispicy, which means he reads the fortune, or he reads things about the future in the intestines of sheep. So that's his real profession. So real estate is like a side hustle for that.
Oh, that's fascinating. Now, here's a good sociological question. What percentage of society could even own a house? Where, and if not 100%, where did everybody else live?
This is a good question, and it's a very hard question to answer. We, while some of the text mentioned that some people lived in tents, so in mobile settlements, most people in the time were actually living in rural villages, and we think they lived in simple houses, and constructing such a house is not really a problem. And especially in the rural villages, the things which were more valuable were like agricultural land where you can plant something and farm something, rather than a plot where you can build like a simple house structure. So we think most people lived in houses, and those houses where we do have the sale documents, those are like luxury dwellings, and they were sold under the among the elite. So the textual sources are usually covering the elite stratum of the society.
Aha. Oh, fascinating. One of our listeners asks, and I would like to know this too, maybe you can show us with your hands, how big are the tablets?
So tablets were made to fit in the palm of your hand. So the larger one are like this, and the smaller ones this, and a long contract they are often like small like this. So when I'm like copying them, I'm often like putting on gloves, and then I'm holding them in my hands, and like they fit in the hands of the ancient scribes, they usually fit like perfectly in the palm of my hand.
Yes, wonderful. After such a substantial purchase, now could the new homeowner purchase some sort of insurance, say against flood or fire or volcano or whatever?
I have not heard about that. So if like the houses were per se not, so they had to repair them quite often, and what we know that they were often like after damage occurred they just like rebuilt. But I think insurance did not exist in ancient Babylonia, but some of my specialist colleagues could say differently, but I haven't heard about this kind of insurance.
Well, we've been talking about homes and dwellings so far, and one of our listeners is asking, do we have any records of sales of shops or businesses?
We do have from later, and I think some from earlier periods. So, but they are rare, like workshops. Again, what's happening here is like really among the real among the elite. And the other thing is they often do not say what all those rooms are used for. So if we have an 18-room house, we think that likely either this was shared between an extended family or some rooms could have been used for other things. So
I see. Oh, that's fascinating. And are there any documents, one person asks, on default on loans?
that's would be the topic of a total different talk, but especially on loans, Babylonian defaulted fairly often, and we have a lot of documents what happened then. And the consequences of this, like of defaulting, is obviously you start what happened in modern time as well. So you can lose your property, but in the end, if you're still defaulting on a loan, you can even lose your personal freedom and become enslaved. So it's like a very dramatic thing if you're defaulting on loans.
Yes, not a desirable outcome, certainly. So back to the question about women, and I must say that the question that I did ask you about, can women inherit, in going through the Q&A, that's been asked 7 or 8 times. So as I said, half of us want to know about this. But did daughters live with brothers if they were not married?
So woman could normally by default woman did not inherit, except if the father was like putting it especially in the testament, then they could inherit. But instead of an inheritance, they usually got a really substantial dowry. And for example, a house could be also part of a dowry. So, and they brought this dowry to their new husbands. So, and then the second part of the question was, sorry.
Did they live with their brother, for example, perhaps?
So there's again the norm and a lot of exceptions, which so normally unmarried women lived in the house of the father. If the father died, normally one of the brothers stood in and they lived with the brother. But there's a lot of ink spilled on women living singly, priestesses living on their own. So it's not unheard of. Widows living on their own. So all this is like not unheard of.
Great. And have we found any other kinds? This question sort of branches out a little bit. Have we found any other kinds of Babylonian contracts, or are house sale documents the most common? I think we were all very impressed with the fact that you had such a sophisticated knowledge through these clay tablets of what is in these. Are these the only kinds of contracts?
No, we do have a lot of other contracts, and I'm so happy about the diversity of the tablets we do have from Babylon, especially, and I'm working on. So after, like, once I'm ready to move on from this archive, and I already started working on the next one is all about barley loans. So people like about those small business loans. Then we do have another archive, which is really fantastic because it covers the business of a merchant. So we see like into a different sphere, doing a lot of trade, making like business contracts. So we get a lot of different pictures about the life in ancient Babylon. And then from Ur, we have all those fantastic like documents where the brewers get into a lot of trouble and committing crimes and doing a lot of shady business. So that's also very fun to explore.
interesting. And here's another zooming out question. To what extent do these activities, these contract activities and transfers of property mirror those of other civilizations, either contemporaneously with the Babylonians or before or after?
So you see me in this very talk jumping a lot to earlier Babylonian period, the old Babylonian period, and the Neo-Babylonian period, though those are the natural comparison. I'm also comparing to the direct neighbor, to Assyria, a lot. And then I'm so grateful in the OI, we do have specialists of Hittite documents, of Egyptian documents, and then in classics, we have like really great people, as you know, doing those. And there's a lot of similarities and differences we like to talk about.
Right. Well, wonderful. No, we already asked that one. Were there any future or forward contracts in ancient Babylon?
Like pointing towards the future, testaments, I would say, are the best.
And those do exist then, I assume.
Yeah, but they are very rare. So.
Well, we are coming up upon 7 p.m. And so I'm going to ask one more question, and then I think we will have to stop. But I want to say that the engagement of the audience has been such that the number of questions has broken the bank of our Q&A function. And for about 10 minutes now, it has registered the number 99 plus. So you've given us so much food for thought. I wanted to ask this question. When you mentioned that these documents were found in clay pots, it reminded me that some documents of another time and another era, I think, were found in clay pots as well, the Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls. So what is it about clay? How is that the best way to preserve these kinds of documents?
The first answer would be it's cheap. So you always have like a lot of vessels around. It's a cheap storage place. It's relatively easy to transport. We know about other ways to store tablets, which are, for example, baskets, but those we do not often find those because they disintegrate in the record. So what we find is mostly like the clay vessels used for storage. And then, yeah, it's easy to do, it's cheap.
Is it waterproof too, or water resistant in some way?
I mean, water resistant. I wouldn't go as far as waterproof, but I mean, if clay tablets are like, what's really special about this one is, and I haven't really seen that they wrap the tablets in straw, and apparently the excavators really found the remainings or the remainders of that straw, which is very uncommon, and we haven't seen many times in Babylonia so far. So,
well, this has been an absolutely marvelous discussion. Thank you, Susanne. Our Dean Salon series will continue on May 19th with musicologist Phil Bowman, who will be speaking about the Eurovision Song Contest. And let me assure you that this won't just be about ABBA. Phil will be telling us how this contest, now more than 60 years old, speaks to, even while ostensibly resisting, Europe's struggles with identity, crisis, and national politics, and much, much more. So thank you all for joining us. I hope all of you are keeping safe and in good spirits during this challenging time, and thank you all for attending. I hope to see many of you again very soon. Thank you. Good evening.